बोले सोने हाल सासरी अकाल।
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to a very special edition of Encounters here on Akaal channel. Today we have a live election 2017 debate. We were hoping to have 5 prospective candidates for you and a live audience handpicked. We do have a live audience. We only have 3 MPs prospective that we're going to grill today. So the Hunger Games encounter style begins now. We're going to leave an empty chair because the Conservatives did say to us that at some point in the evening they will have a candidate that will participate, so that chair remains empty for them to fill. And the Liberal Democrats candidate Lee Darg offered his sincere apologies because he became ill during the day and progressively it got worse, so he was unable to attend. So with us today are Chris Williamson, representing Labour in Derby North. We have Samantha Pankeri, who is a Green MP, and she will be representing her constituents hopefully on June the 9th from Stone in Staffordshire. And we have the independent MP who will be supported by the newly formed Panth Party, Mr. Jagmeet Singh. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome. I was only joking about the Hunger Games, but it might be a little bit that way, especially when I introduce to you who will be asking the questions tonight, and that is the audience. The audience is made up of Mrs. Sukhwinder Kaur, who is a activist with and a charity worker with Sikh Relief, the charity that most at home will be aware of their work and what they do. And Dr. Gurnam Singh, who is a lecturer of sociology at Coventry University, a social activist and a presenter here at Akaal channel, as you well know. We have Mr. Jaswant Bora, who is an author, an expert on extremism and radicalisation. We have Mrs. Dr. Manjeet Kaur Vihal and her colleague Suba Rasab, who both work for CRASAC, which is an arm of the Rape Crisis Centre, the National Rape Crisis Centre. We have Jagveer Singh, who is a postgraduate and social activist. We have Dr. Pyara Singh Bogle, who is representing today the Sikh Council UK. He is the Vice Secretary General of that. And we have with us finally, and not by any means least, we have with us Jasveer Singh Gill, who is the brains and the mind behind the Sikh Press Association. So without further ado, let us go ahead and ask the first question, which will be my first and only question formally. I will sort of interject if I feel that something needs to be repeated or clarified. But the first question is to our panel. With apathy being the enemy of a democratic process, and with MPs' expenses, the last election having a very minimal voter turnout, why should anybody engage with the political process only 2 years after a general election? Chris?
Well, I think that Labour has now put forward a very radical progressive agenda in our manifesto. This is the best manifesto that Labour has produced since 1945. Some people have characterised it as extreme left, hard left. I don't see it that way. For me, it's not a matter of left and right, it's a matter of right and wrong. And, you know, for far too long, I think, political parties, the mainstream political parties, including the Labour Party and New Labour, which is a kind of sort of a new political party, Tony Benn once suggested, cuckoos in the nest, I think he described it as being, became too close to the Conservative Party. And I think a lot of people, therefore, switched off the political process. And there is a lot of talk about, you know, Labour lost over 5 million votes from 1997 through to 2010. But what is less talked about is the fact that Labour lost 3 million votes between 1997 and the next election in 2001, where the turnout, I think, was under 60%. And I think a lot of people became disillusioned and cynical about politics because they felt that, you know, the parties all became too close. Now, in my opinion, it's always better having a Labour government than
a Conservative one, you'd expect me to say that. And even under those new Labour years, whilst I don't think they went anywhere near far enough and they didn't, fundamentally transform the economy and society in the way in which I think they should have done, they did nevertheless put extra money into our public services, to our NHS and education and so on. But what they didn't do is make those fundamental changes which I think were needed. Now, in the last election, there was quite a lot of good things, I think, in our manifesto, but Ed Balls, our Shadow Chancellor at the time, was still talking about an austerity-light programme. So we were going into that election promising to make cuts still. And I think that actually did disillusion people, and they didn't feel that there was sufficient difference. And I certainly had that because I was the MP until 2015 in Derby North, and the Green Party stood in Derby North on that occasion, even though I'd been described as the greenest MP elected in 2010, and which is quite an accolade because Caroline Lucas was elected in that year as well. There was a sense that, I think, certainly within the Green Party activists in Derby who stood, that Labour just wasn't offering a sufficiently progressive agenda, and that's why they stood, even though they quite liked the sort of programme that I stood for, and the opinion polls suggested we were going to win by a handsome margin anyway, and a lot of Green voters were telling me it's safe to vote Green in Derby North because you're going to win by a landslide, Chris. Now, just to kind of conclude, there were 15.6 million people across the country who didn't vote in the last election. In my own constituency of Derby North, 25,000 people did not vote. And the Tories won with 16,500, and we got just under 16,500. They only won by 41 votes. And what we've got to therefore do, it seems to me, is put forward a programme, and I hope and believe that this will engage with, has engaged with a lot more people. Certainly, a lot more young people are engaging with politics. And there was a poll, if you believe polls anymore, that was published, I think, yesterday or the day before, YouGov, of 18 to 24-year-olds. 67% say they are certain to vote, and within that cohort, Labour has a 37% lead over the Conservatives. I firmly believe, therefore, that if we can reach out and mobilise those young people, Labour will win this election. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to demonstrate there's clear red water, if you like, between the Tories and the Labour Party. I believe this manifesto does it. It remains to be seen whether we actually do mobilise people on the day, but I'm hopeful that this will actually achieve that result.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also quite a big fan of Labour's current manifesto. A lot of the things that were in there were in our 2015 manifesto, so it's great to see that Labour have caught up with the ideas that we've been supporting for quite some time. But just coming back to the question, why should people bother to engage? We only had the general election 2 years ago, the EU referendum last year. I mean, I certainly know people I'm talking to on the street have election fatigue and are just exhausted by the whole process and fed up of politicians coming out and saying, trust us, you can definitely trust us, maybe you shouldn't trust us, and that's how people feel. I think the reason that people with this particular election must engage with the process and must go out and vote is because we've seen the price of not engaging already. We've seen what low turnout does, and Chris particularly has personal experience of that, losing his seat largely, because of low turnout. And again, where I live in Stoke-on-Trent, we were the only constituency in the country to have more people who didn't vote than did. 49% turnout, 51% of people didn't even vote. So this engagement, this election particularly, I feel that the stakes are so much higher than with other general elections. We're not just talking about which party do we want to form the next government for the next 5 years. With Brexit coming up and those negotiations on the table, we're voting for the people that we want to shape the future of our country for generations to come. The things that are going to be negotiated as part of that deal will affect our children and our children's children, and really we're talking about our entire national collective future here. So people who are choosing to not engage in that are doing themselves an enormous disservice there. We have a real problem in politics of it being incredibly, it's male and pale and stale, and you only have to look at the Prime Minister's questions and you see the embarrassment there, all these white men sitting around and barking at each other. And I think that in order to change that system, in order to bring about democratic reform and electoral reform, we've got to get people engaging in that system and saying politics is something that affects all of us. It's something that we do. It's not something that you do to us. And I'm really hoping that that's something that we can start the process of with this election. And it starts on June the 8th. It doesn't end on June the 8th.
Very good, thank you. Just meeting.
Just want to say to the Sangat Vaheguru Ji Ka
Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
So your question dealt with apathy from voters and low voter turnout.
Yeah, and the lack of trust.
And the lack of trust. The truth is, the answer is not going to come from a broken system. So what we've heard so far is literally the rehashing of 30 years of what's been going on. I believe that the answer is going to come from you, the people, the voters out there, the disengaged. It's up to the few, somebody, to try to invigorate and enliven them and ask them to step forward and take participation themselves. With God's blessing, I myself have started a new party with the local community and the national community. It's called the Panth Party, and it's a brand new initiative to actually reach out to those people that don't trust politicians. One of the main reasons people do not trust politicians is because all of the double talk. Nobody actually tells it to you straight. They will give you a roundabout answer. You can watch Theresa May do it as a classic example, and you can watch a lot of Tory politicians do it to a T, and unfortunately, when we do ask them to come, some of them just don't bother showing up, which I hope they come, but don't hold your breath. That being said, we need straight talking, honest people. And I would say everybody needs to keep paying attention to what's happened. The fact is that 50% or over 50% of under 25-year-olds that are actually registered to vote, they don't bother showing up to the polls, and I don't blame them. I blame the people that uninspired them. And the truth is that the system is set and created in such a way that it's set up to make you apathetic. It's set up to not make you want to vote. It's set up in such a horrible way. So we, the people, need to start demanding more from our government, again, now, for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years, for our children's generation. Because if we're apathetic now, we can't be apathetic for our children's generation. It's up to our generation and the people that are around now to get involved and spark a change that could actually create real change. One thing I've seen in my life is change does not come from politicians. Change never comes from politicians. Change comes from the regular people putting pressure on politicians. So it's when you, the regular people, choose, the ordinary common man, woman, the British public choose to have a different world, then we will have that world. Now, I want to finish by saying, myself, I was one of those apathetic people. I was one of those people that thought, why would I ever vote for any of these people who never tell us the truth and are just in it for their own gain, towing the party line, and just for themselves? Why would I possibly waste my time? Because it's never going to affect any real change in my life. And then two major world events happened. First was Brexit. I never expected Brexit to result in the United Kingdom leaving Europe. And I'm pretty sure 99% of the world was with me when we were shocked to wake up that morning. I followed it through the night. The Pro and the Remain leaders did not expect it to happen because they all ended up quitting or getting fired immediately afterwards. Now you tell me what that says about your leadership if they all have to leave their jobs immediately after the biggest vote in our generation. The system is broken. The second is the rise of Trump. I'm not a Donald Trump fan, but that candidacy started as a political joke. It was satire to a T. And it ended with a buffoon being in the most powerful seat in the world, arguably. So these two major world events opened my eyes, and it said, you know what? This thing in the West called democracy, where everybody shows up, places one vote, they do get counted, and the unexpected can happen. And personally, I had never seen that in my lifetime until twice in 18 months. So then I thought, you know what? We must get involved. So I implore everybody, show up on June the 8th, but from now until then, do as much research and look within inside your hearts to find who is telling you the truth. Nationally, I'll say it right now, I do love Greens, because you know what? The Greens, they support what? The earth. So I love that. And I do like Labour. I'm a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. Now these are my quote-unquote opponents, but I'll tell it to you straight, I love them both. I wish them the best of luck for where they are, because they're going to be good for our country and my children and your children. Nationally, I do like Labour to win. I don't trust a Tory as far as I can throw one. Locally, in Wolverhampton South West, it must be myself, the independent candidate, because nobody else you can trust to do the job for you. Another Tory another Tory at the table in Parliament will only toe the party line. A weak individual from Labour that is not going to actually work for the constituents of Wolverhampton Southwest is not going to help you. What we need is fresh blood, and I'm excited for this particular election because this is a chance for Wolverhampton Southwest to get on the map nationally and send a global message that says we care about everybody, the marginalized, the poor people. We do not only care about big business, we care about every individual in our society, and we want you to care. And together, I believe we can make a massive difference and make the apathetic into activists like myself.
Thank you, Jagmeet Singh. Can I just say politely that due to the constraints of time, if we can keep our answers as concise as possible so we can move on question, rather than long-winded answers, just the easy, I think half of the apathy we're going to experience from our audience today is going to be one of being over-explained to. So if we can, when we move on to the questions now, if you can answer them as concisely as possible, because then it allows for the elaboration of the point also, because they may have a follow-up question, which they may well forget by the time the answer is complete. So if we can, I think a very relevant question at the moment would be in the wake of the atrocities we've seen in the north of England and in Manchester. If I think maybe Suba Rasab would like to ask a question, and I think that Suki Kaur has something very, very relevant to add to that, to the question. So it will be a double question, so to speak, or double-barreled.
Okay, so my question is really more around hate crime, in particular towards the Muslim community, and what my question is that hate crime against Muslim women, like Gurmukh said about, since those attacks and since things like Westminster have increased, there's an organisation called Tal Mama who actually record anti-Muslim hate crimes, and they have reported that since Manchester, they received, just a day after, they received 50 reports within that day. Usually they get 7 to 10 reports, so it was a massive increase. So what my question really is what is you and your party going to do to make sure that Muslims within our communities are safe, but also to ensure that they're not being attacked, they're not being ostracised, and further division isn't being caused within our societies, and not just Muslim communities, but those people who are perceived as Muslim, because we know they're also attacked because of ignorance. What are you practically going to do to ensure their safety within our communities and really bring back that unity?
It's okay.
Oh, go on.
Mine's very similar. I mean, over a third of the BAME community have been racially abused or have witnessed racist abuse since the Brexit vote. And recently a report by the Trades Union Congress has revealed that more recently crime has doubled since the Brexit vote, since the Manchester attack as well. I mean, our country at the moment is more divided than ever. How will you, the government, at a national and local level, work with local agencies to prioritise community cohesion and bring about tougher sanctions as well for those people who are, going out racially abusing? Because many people just don't want to report it because it's like, what's going to be done? So, there has to be something around sanctions, around hate crime. So what would you guys do to tackle that? Thank you.
Chris, if you'd like to start again.
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost is that Labour has very clearly said that we would reinvest in our public services. And I think one of the problems that we've now got is it's not just in terms of policing, which has been decimated, frankly, as a result of funding cuts. And, we've heard Tory Home Secretary saying, well, crime has fallen, so there's not a correlation between police numbers and the amount of crime. I do think there is an issue about making people feel safe. That often the actuality of crime lags behind fear of crime. So we need to do something about that. One of the things we've said is we'll reverse the cuts in our public services, reverse the cuts that have been made in policing numbers. We will recruit 10,000 new police officers. That's the first thing. Also make sure that we are properly resourcing the intelligence services within the police services, up and down the constabularies. In terms of I was listening to a Newsnight report, and they were interviewing a sort of security expert who was suggesting that it's only the Metropolitan Police that has the appropriate resources really to respond to the challenges. Every other constabulary, according to this expert, is really lagging behind. So there's that. But I think we've also got to be doing more in terms of investing in our youth services and providing for the sort of activities which are really important, because it's often young people who end up being radicalised, and we need to find ways of ensuring that we can protect those young people and give them the support that they need to prevent that from happening in the first place. Now, I've had a little bit of experience of this when I was I was leader of the council, but it was before that, when I was a deputy leader. There's an organisation called Al Mujirun, you may have heard of. I think they're a banned organisation now, and they were recruiting a lot of young people with Pakistani heritage in Derby. And we, after picking up the point was made, nothing's ever achieved really simply by politicians bestowing goodly works. I mean, a bit of that comes, but it's often as a result of pressure from below. And there was representations made to me about what we could do, and a suggestion that we employ some specialist youth workers who could engage directly with those young people. And this is what we did, and it had an absolutely brilliant effect. It worked, and the young people that had been attracted by Al Mujirun stopped being attracted by them because there were other activities and youth work directed towards them. So I think it's really important that we're investing in our youth service, investing in our policing, investing in our education service, and tackling some of the problems that lead to resentment, and which is sometimes then taken out on the BAME community. And that means giving people hope again. And this is why I come back to this manifesto. I think it absolutely does that. Because we're talking about creating decent jobs again. We're talking about a minimum wage of £10 an hour, tackling the housing crisis. And I sometimes hear it on the doorstep as I go round about, immigration is the cause of the housing problem. Immigration is the cause of low wages. Immigration is the cause of our public services being under pressure. Of course, that's not true. But it's a difficult argument to challenge really, and get people thinking. I always say, look, lift your eyes above the horizon and look at what is actually causing these problems. So I think an economy that works for ordinary people, investing in our public services, investing in our youth services, etc., I think would have a fundamental impact, actually protect people, and go a long way towards reducing and hopefully eliminating the radicalisation which some young people have been duped into getting involved with.
Chris, if I may, what does the Labour manifesto say on how would it tackle somebody like you've mentioned, Al Mujirun? The figurehead of that is, of course, Anjem Choudhury. He is still in a position to influence young, impressionable children. He hasn't been stopped from what he's doing, and continually proscribing the different names of his organisations is only a paper exercise.
No, I agree.
So what does the Labour manifesto have by way of remedying that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right, and I don't think simply prescribing organisations is the way forward, locking people up. You've got to actually win, hearts and minds. You've got to win, the battle of ideas, and it comes back to this isn't rocket science. I don't think. This is about, and as I come back to the point, it's about making sure we're investing in our public services, that we're working with our communities and allowing communities to have a greater influence over how public services are actually delivered in our communities. And when we do that,
is it simply a matter of public services?
It's not just a matter of public service. It's about public services working in concert with the community. And I think it's really important, therefore, that we have a kind of, if you like, a sort of neighbourhood approach, really, a neighbourhood agenda, whereby, communities are empowered as well. But it's a complex issue because it's about public services, it's about empowering communities, it's about giving communities, the ability to influence those public services. It's about tackling, the economic deprivation which exists in our society at the moment, and tackling some of those resentments, because the extremism isn't just, confined to people who are attracted by ISIL. You have the right-wing extremists, the English Defence League, and even more extreme organisations than that. And we know, of course, the tragic murder of Joe Cox last year by a fascist extremist, is an example of that. And
the Sikh was almost beheaded in Wales.
Absolutely,
by somebody with a similar mindset.
Well, absolutely right. And so, it's a complex thing, and it's about all these pieces of the jigsaw really being brought together. But you're not going to achieve that, though, while ever we have a programme of austerity, which I think is exacerbating this problem, actually. And you know, as I say, I'm a big supporter of ensuring that, you know, we have good quality public services that are working in, you know, collaboration with the community at large. And I think that partnership arrangement, it gives you a fighting chance of overcoming the extremism. And as I say, I've had a small example of the situation in Derby, whereby this type of approach can actually work.
Okay, Samantha, do you need reminding of the original question?
No, I wrote them down. I'm okay.
Okay.
So just coming back to the original question, you know, what would you do to tackle hate crimes against Muslim people and people who are perceived as being Muslim, and you know, protecting people? I think we have to look at who the perpetrators are, largely, of these hate crimes, and they are generally young, radicalised white males. And I think that using that term radicalised is really important, because people tend to assume that it only applies to, you know, the Muslim radicalisation, and it doesn't. It really is applicable to as you said, the right wings, the rise of neo-Nazism and fascism. And I think actually a large portion of that comes back to the media and how the media portrays Muslims. You know, you only have to Google very quickly to look at the headlines of you know, certain right-wing newspapers to see that the hysteria that is propagated, you know, and what you have here, I took a really interesting quiz online, and it was written to see if you could tell the difference between right-wing anti-Muslim propaganda and 1930s Nazi anti-Jew propaganda. And it just took sentences and phrases that had appeared in propaganda from the 1930s and the newspapers since probably for about past 4 or 5 years. And the number that you could not tell the difference was absolutely astonishing. And it's something that you know, people are starting to recognise more and more, is that Muslims are being scapegoated in the media. And it's really telling when you have incidents like, you know, we've seen just yesterday in America with the 2 young men who were murdered by a white supremacist, a known white supremacist who was known to the authorities for those extremist views. We had, as you say, the tragic murder of Joe Cox last year. And then really interestingly, this week as well, there was a young white British man who was convicted of trying to put a bomb on a London Underground train, and convicted for that. Did anybody hear the word terrorist used in conjunction with him? Because I didn't. If he had been Muslim or presented as Muslim, that word would have been everywhere. It really would have been. And that's something that I feel is driving the division here. And it's fueling the right wing. It's fueling the impressionable people who are full of hate because they're full of fear. And they're full of fear because, and I think that there is a certain, you know, definitely really important level of truth in the fact that it comes back to people perceiving that there is injustice, that they need to stand up and fight against, you know, housing and the NHS and education are all under threat. And they're being pointed this way, saying blame these people over here, blame migrants, and especially if they happen to be Muslim, we'll give you a really good reason to hate them there. And all that happens then is while we're fighting amongst ourselves, we're not pointing fingers at the true culprits, the people in power. And we're not, I mean, I suppose I come back to banging my tin drum about electoral reform, but the only way we can really challenge that is to break up the media monopoly, because all of these papers that print all this hateful thing and drive this division are owned by a very small group of people. You break up that monopoly, you get more diversity in who actually controls the media, you get more diversity and representation in Parliament, in the decision makers, and you start to see public services being invested in properly. You start to see facts and proper representation of this amazing multicultural country we have actually out there in the media, in culture, in entertainment, and you find that hatred and that division, you know, works itself out. But it is almost like a set of dominoes you have lined up, and you have to pick which one do you go for first. Do you tackle the media first? Do you tackle investment in public services? Do you know, try and get better people into government? And it is a really intricate thing, but I think to me it comes back so much to how the media portray people and the difference in how people are treated if they're white and if they're not.
Thank you for that, Samantha. Jagmeet Singh, your views, please.
Thank you for the question. I just want to say before I answer the question that, you know, it might be worth Akaal channel prepping their guests in regards to how much time they are allowed before the live show starts, because I don't think anybody really knows how much time we are given, or maybe some kind of a timer might work, but that can be taken up later. In regards to the question at hand, I will try to keep my answer as short and concise as possible. First, my heart goes out to everybody affected in the terrible tragedy, the terrorist attack on Manchester. with 22 young souls and families being butchered and massacred. So I think, number one, to deal with the issues that our public, our citizens are facing, we have to understand where their hatred comes from, where it stems from. So obviously a terrorist threat and alert and situation and an actual attack here will cause problems for the regular Muslims that have actually nothing to do with it. And myself being Sikh, I know this firsthand because our Sikhs, men and women, children themselves, we often get, unfortunately, profiled as the worst kind of Muslim, the terrorists that you might see on the TV, the Osama bin Laden types, because they just happen to wear a turban and a beard, which is not indicative of 99% of householder Muslims. So I think one of the things that we can do is start admitting that we have a problem and getting the mechanisms in place to report the problem. Because I believe government is not going to ever do anything unless they have the data to back what they have to do. So I know that the Sikhs, the Sikh Council UK, and a lot of Sikh organizations have got together, and they've actually got something called Sikh Aware now, where it's a website where you can go and put in any kind of verbal abuse, hate crime, whatever it is, whatever you think if it's important or not important, if it's big or small. If we start logging it, then we can start tracking what pockets of society have this problem. And obviously this is needed for the Muslim community, the LGBTQ community, the Jewish community, the black community, any minority community that may be marginalized. So first we need to start tracking and speaking up. Another thing is you do see a lot of times videos go around on YouTube where people are being attacked, and I think one of the most shameful things that comes out of the video is you have a large portion of the public around them that don't actually say anything. So I would request everybody to actually engage the abusers, and one or two positive voices can stifle a negative voice, and they might think twice about doing it again. So we as a community must stand up and remember that that it goes beyond what our physical appearance is. Yourself being Muslim, you're just as much my sister as a white woman, as a black woman, or a Sikh woman. We're all one family. So we have to recognize each other as one family and start taking care of each other in that way. The last thing I'll say, because I know we are limited on time, is we need diversity in your government. How can the common man on the street relate to a person of a different appearance if they're not represented by the government that governs them? We have 0 Sikh MPs, noticeable Sikh MPs, in Parliament. 0. And that's absolutely non-representative when the Sikh population being anywhere from 400,000 to 700,000, depending on what statistics you take. We're at least 1% of the UK population. That should equate to at least 6 to 7 MPs in Parliament. We have 0 right now, and we as a people, the white man, the black man, the Indian man, everybody has a responsibility to elect a more representative government, and then we can at least start tackling these deals in a very real way.
We say thank you for your answer. If I may, if I can just reiterate, the question was from you've answered the Sikh portion of that question. The other portion of the question was about hate crime towards Muslim women. That is recorded. There are figures for that. There is an organisation called Tal Mama that does exactly that. And that after the Manchester attack, there were 50 reports, and it's only been days since that. And they're used to their volumes are normally 7 or 10 days, 7 or 10 reports a day. And to have 50 within such a short space of time between an attack, that's a sharp increase of scrutiny of a physically and verbally aggressive kind. And the question was, what would you do about that?
Certainly. So I think it was answered within my original question. I'll reiterate that it's not only a Muslim issue. Specifically to Muslims, definitely we all need to band together, and if we see an attack on a Muslim, if we see an attack on any minority, is my point, in all minorities, we must learn the lesson from the Muslims. We must see what you're going through and understand that it goes through all communities that are minorities in this country, and it starts with logging it like these websites that you do have, making sure that government is aware of it, making sure that the general public is aware of the problem. Because if the general public don't even know there is a problem, then they might not stand up for those people. So we need to recognize that we are all one family. that the Muslim sister is my sister, that we are all one family, and that's it. Treat them like a human being.
Thank you. Suki Kaur, are we happy with the answers?
I think I'd
Suba, have you got
a follow-up question.
Okay. I think you all really did address why it happens and all that kind of thing, and it does happen, and there's enough on social media and media in itself to prove that these things are going on. Really what I'd like to follow up on is what Suki said, is about what are you going to do about sanctioning the people who are doing it, because it's all well and great knowing it's a problem, it's all well and great having the figures and having it recorded and having these people attacked, and we know it's happening, but what happens to the people on the other side? How do we get that message out that this isn't acceptable? Because creating that unity isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time to bring that unity together. And we've had this issue, you go back to the 60s and people of the black community, the Irish community, is it going to be where we're going to be in 50 years' time and it's going to be another minority who's going to be going through it? How do we crack down on it now and say this is not acceptable in our country?
I think Gurnaam Singh's got something to add.
I just wanted to kind of just put a broader context to some of this debate. There are some other very worrying developments that we need to throw into the pot. The first is the direction that UKIP are taking. I mean, for many years UKIP were on the rise. Partly they were mopping up some of the extreme vote because it was oriented towards an English nationalism, if you know, or a UK nationalism. Now that part of their project has kind of ended, and the recent manifesto launch of the UKIP as well kind of confirms this, that they're seemingly now targeting Muslim communities directly. And their kind of main, it's about stopping the Islamification of the UK, these kind of scaremongering. So I think that's a real worry in terms of maybe UKIP now turning towards more of their extreme xenophobic right-wing, overt BNP kind of tendencies. So I'd like some comment on that. And also Katie Hopkins's recent terrible statement, which again she's been sacked now, or she resigned. I don't know whether she resigned or sacked, but she's not on LBC. But for her to say that suggests that that it's the extreme right wing that is responsible for these attacks, not the working class, white working class people. In Manchester, for example, we saw a wonderful illustration that white working class people are decent people. And it's these extremists who often in position to power that exploit those sentiments. So we really need to lance this idea that somehow it's white working class. They've been the victims of 30 years of right-wing policies. So I think that we do need to. It's a complicated, situation.
I would say centuries of right-wing policies.
Who do we want?
Yeah,
I can go first if you want.
if you like, yes, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So number one, to answer it as directly and as specifically as possible, I would increase much harsher penalties for the perpetrators and make examples out of people. So if it happens this week, it's international news, and you won't think about doing it twice. You'll think about what comes out of your mouth. You won't think about striking another person or committing a crime. Because I do believe that if the penalty is severe enough, that you won't do it. Now, this is proven just a couple of weeks back when the penalty points doubled for using a mobile phone in the cars. As soon as the penalty rose, it created real change in the habits of people in their daily lives. And where was the will before when mobile phones are proven to take lives, to kill babies, to kill whole families? But the people did not have the will, there was no political will to change that tragedy until the tougher laws were put into place, and then almost instantly overnight that changed. So number one, it would be much more harsher penalties for perpetrators, making examples out of people and recognizing it's also verbal abuse and it's physical abuse. And I don't think we should categorize certain people, because actually one of the main things that went through my mind when joining this political arena in this election cycle was the rise of UKIP. Because I truly felt that whether it was their intention or not, that the conversation around Brexit was so diverse, so heated, so racially charged, that it caused real racism on the street. I know we all felt it.
Yeah.
And it was a sad time in our lives. And it opened my eyes. As an apathetic voter and as an apathetic person within the political arena, it said, you know what? If they, with their ideas, because all politics at the end of the day is just sharing your own ideas, right? So if they, with their ideas, can cause real crime, hate, abuse, and physical abuse on the streets, why can't we, with our political party and our political agenda, do the opposite? So my campaign is for love. It's for caring, sharing, working hard, and taking care of your neighbor. And I know just being involved in the conversation and making sure it's steered around there and encouraging that, and even myself being helping add a bit more, let's say, diversity to this panel, you know, I think that's a win for us right there too. So I think it's going to take more people of different backgrounds to get involved, and for us to start treating crime as it is and make examples of people so they won't think of doing it twice.
Samantha, is legislation capable of stigmatizing social behavior to a point where it becomes socially unacceptable to behave in particular ways? With xenophobia in particular, considering we've had the 50s, 60s, 70s, the rise of the NF, the disappearance of the NF, the rise of the BNP, is legislation capable of achieving that?
I don't think it is on its own. Because I mean, we have laws at the moment about race hate crime, about so many things, and yet we see that it proliferates anyway. And I think largely that comes back to it's become almost socially acceptable now to say really hateful right-wing things. And Katie Hopkins is a prime example. Yeah. She became famous through being infamous for being essentially a horrible person. And the fact that she has been sacked or she's left LBC under whatever circumstances isn't going to mean she goes away. She's still a columnist for the Daily Mail, that wonderfully tolerant piece of journalism that we all know and love. So I don't think that just saying harsher prison sentences is an answer in itself. And what I come back to again, I'd said about the press previously, is imagining how would somebody like the Daily Mail report a sudden increase in harsher penalties for perpetrators of hate crimes against Muslims. I can only imagine the sorts of headlines that they would put out. And actually I think that it would it would cause and drive more division, which would then in turn probably drive up
they'd portray them as victims and as martyrs?
I think they probably would. I wouldn't put it past them at all, because you see all the time, the minute that you come up to Easter or Christmas, all of a sudden the headlines are saying, oh, we can't say Easter egg now. We're not allowed to say Merry Christmas. And it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, but it's nonsense that sells. So they keep on printing it, and then it drives the division even more. And it's absolutely absurd that it's allowed to happen. And that really is what, to my mind, makes it socially acceptable for people to hold these views and voice these views, and then, in turn go out and actually commit crimes against people. And I think we do have a problem with how then communities who are affected by this feel able to reach out to the police forces and the authorities that are supposed to protect them. We don't have a very well-funded police force anymore. The cuts there have dried up the flow of information, and they have increased crime as a direct result because of that. And we have, even then systemic problems. So, a piece of information I read earlier which says that hate crimes against Sikhs, when reported to the police, are recorded as Islamophobia. So they're not even recorded correctly. So how can you pin down exactly how to tackle?
We've got the new website for that, to address that exact problem.
Yeah. So that's something that hopefully will start to address that problem. But it's meant historically, all these hate crimes that have happened previously have been recorded as Islamophobia.
Without tougher laws, how are you possibly going to change somebody's habits? Because one thing that again came out with UKIP really was that people were quiet about their bigoted views. We thought through the 90s and the 2000s that we were living in a much more peaceful, secular, a pluralistic society. But the second they got the chance to be open with their bigoted views, so I kind of discount what you're saying there, because unless we do have harsher penalties that are going to, I'm not living in some kind of fantasy world where I think that we're going to actually erase hate from the internal depths of somebody's heart when they are out there committing these evil acts of atrocities. But what we can do is control their behaviors. So we as minorities and people that are affected by these crimes should be able to feel safe to go out in the public and not be victimized. So I think tougher crime laws are going to help do that. And then we also need to work on that hate. That is a two-prong. So we need to work on building the community cohesions and actually working directly to help build the community into one society.
But tougher laws are only effective if they can be enforced.
Certainly.
And that's the difficulty here, is that we could come up with the laws and we could create the penalties here, but if we don't have the police force there to actually enforce them, if we don't have a police force where people in the community affected here feel that they can actually report what's happening and that it will genuinely be followed through,
then tougher laws and more police.
Tougher laws on by themselves.
But that's not going to happen with the Tory government.
No, it's absolutely not. It's not. But again, and I think at the same time as saying that there have to be consequences and there have to be measures in place that mean that people from marginalised communities feel safer and that people who perpetrate hate crimes of any nature face consequences for that. You have to come back, as you said, to the root cause, and I think it's a combination of the things that you and Chris have been saying.
But the thing is, I'm not actually only talking about the marginalised communities. I'm also talking about the white man, because I should not, or somebody else should not, be able to say anything racist to anybody, because that is also a hate crime. So all too often they get marginalised. So it's about every member of society. Yeah, obviously we need more police. We definitely need more police, but we need strict laws, and we need to make sure that's publicised, that if you do this, if you say this, that is not acceptable in our society, and then we will be able to change people's habits through that.
But I think, again, I'm so sorry, Chris, Dominic's not giving you a look in here, are we?
I'm making some notes.
I think we really can't overlook the role of social media, the press media in this, and subtle things as well that people discount, like, walking. I take my children, I was trying to explain to them what white privilege is. I'm white, my children are white, and I was trying to explain to them the concept, they're only small. And I took them into the corner shop, and I stood them in front of the rack of magazines, and I said, show me a single person on this rack of magazines who's not white. And they couldn't. And because we don't have that diversity and representation in all of these areas, it makes it so much easier for the right-wing press and for the right-wing extremists to marginalise people even further and to demonise people, driving the division, driving the hate that fuels these crimes.
Yes.
But it appears that we're quick to move to introduce terrorism legislation, and we can understand why. But going back to some of your questions, what about issues around race? And Stephen Lawrence, we learned a lot of lessons from Stephen Lawrence in 1993, and the inquiry took so long, and we just about got the Race Relations Act 2000. And I think we need more, don't we, in this country? But 2000 Terrorism Act comes out, then we have 2001 post 9/11, and 2005, 6, 8, 10. And just recently, the CTSA, Counter Terrorism Security Act 2015. But isn't racism equally a bigger problem in another sense, where it does fuel issues around extremism, it does segregate communities? So I think we need to look a lot more around issues of race, just to tie into some of the questions there.
Does the prevent legislation actually sort of act contradictory to what it needs to be doing?
Well, in terms
is it responsible for a non-cohesive society?
Prevent as a counter-terrorism measure, and really this is my question, really, if I get the opportunity now, when Chris alluded to some of the points in regards to how we should address it in terms of front line, and in the UK, 2005 we had the terror attacks, and we know how many people got killed there, and we had, right up until what happened this week and the atrocities, we had Westminster, we had Manchester. 80 plus people have been killed as a direct result of a terrorist attack in the UK, and we're aware what happened probably in 2007 when Jonathan Evans, a former MI5, warned us about the threat of young people being radicalised. So we got a big problem, because that's my question to the panel, really. I can throw it back to the panel, is in light of these current terror attacks, what can be done to better protect children and people that are at risk from becoming radicalised? And I think you probably answered some of that, but you can go into it. And in terms of prevent as a counter-terrorism measure, do you believe it's effective? I've delivered it, I've seen it in work, I've seen it change. I went to the last Prevent review, I have my views on it and my research, but as far as the panel is concerned, individual, do you feel that we need more to better protect? And do you feel that Prevent is an effective counter-terrorism response?
Well, I don't think Prevent strategy is fit for purpose, and when I was leader of the council, made those criticisms at the time. And in terms of stopping radicalisation, it's not really worked in that sense. And I think some of the points I made in relation to the Alma-Jeroen scenario in Derby, I think, is a microcosm of the sort of activities that we need to be doing and scaling up, as it were, to address that. I agree with everything I think that Samantha said. I completely disagree that stiffer penalties are the answer. We've already got hate crime on the statute book. Stiffer penalties won't work. On their own, they will not work. We've got to win hearts and minds. This is stiffer penalties, a kind of top-down approach. What we need to do is kind of engender a sense of social solidarity And despite my youthful appearance, I remember the formation of the Anti-Nazi League when the National Front were on the rise in the late 1970s, and they were getting substantial votes in local elections, and they were standing sufficient candidates to put their kind of racist filth on party political broadcasts at that time. But it was by the community united together under the auspices of the Anti-Nazi League that I think, were able to push back the National Front at that time. It's not to say we obviously defeated them completely, because we didn't, but there are other factors which have come into play which have helped to, I think, and I've touched on this already, exacerbate some of those tensions in communities.
I'm only a minute and a half away from an advert.
Okay, cool.
But you've said that the Prevent is not fit for purpose, the Prevent Act, or the legislation. What in the manifesto do you propose to replace it with?
It was Labour that introduced it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate, yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. Well, listen, yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely.
So that's historic of Labour. They can't figure it out within their own party. It's one of the major problems.
And there is no simplistic answer to these things. I think it was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction in that sense. I think probably over the best of motives. But it needs to be more sophisticated, I think. It was it's so much of a kind of a blunt instrument, if you like, too one-dimensional in that sense. And I think you need a much more sophisticated approach, and you've got to bring the community with you. You can't, propose these kind of solutions from on high in that sense. And that's why I come back to this thing and touching on some of the points I made earlier on. We've got to bring the community together. And one of the things I think Samantha touched on was in relation to the media. We've got to get a grip of the media, it seems to me, because they're actually driving a lot of the kind of bigotry which exists in this country. And one of the things that we've said very clearly is that we will implement Leveson in full, and I think that will go a long way to actually, tackling the abuse, frankly, that the right-wing media are indulging in, which is actually helping to ferment some of. And you've kind of made the point, I think, some of the kind of race hate that we are beginning to see surface again. But stiffer penalties, I don't think will work.
Well, unless you're not going to put stiffer penalties on the media, then how are you going to regulate them? So I think it comes back to the
you've got to win hearts and minds. You've asked a very, very relevant question. We're just going to go to a break now. We're going to come back with that very question. Okay, we'll see you after the break for more of the debate. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Anji, and welcome to our very, very brand new show, After Hours, because here we'll be covering the topics which are not normally covered during the hours.
Akaal badam kha ke nahi aandi, Akaal thokra kha ke aandi.
Thokra kha ke aandi, bilkul. As long as you're working, you will find a way to kind of get back onto your own feet.
But some people, they like to use their power, even they haven't got it.
Welcome back to the debate. We're still here. We were touching on Leveson, whether it would be implemented by the Labour Party, and we were talking about the media and the media's role in influencing people and public debate, and even egging people on to become, encouraging frustrations to be sort of manifested in verbal and physical abuse even. And with that in mind, just really saying of the Sikh Press Association has a question for the panel. Just for you, sir.
In 2015, the Daily Mail published an article online about alleged Sikh terror camps in the UK. They cited a dossier that was on Sikh radicalism that was to be handed to David Cameron by then visiting Prime Minister Narendra Modi. After investigations by the Sikh Council UK, the Secretary of Parliament clarified that no such dossier existed and was ever handed to the British government. Police forces... It's on.
Should we from the top again, please?
I'll start again.
No worries.
In 2015, the Daily Mail published an article online about alleged Sikh terror camps in the UK. They cited a dossier on Sikh radicalism that was to be handed to then Prime Minister David Cameron by the Indian visiting PM Narendra Modi. After investigations by the Sikh Council, it was found that no such dossier was ever handed to Parliament, and police forces also interjected and denied any evidence of any Sikh terror camps in the UK. Despite this, the Daily Mail were cleared of any wrongdoing by the Independent Press Standards Organisation, and the article is still online to this day. The Tory manifesto stated that they'll scrap the Leveson inquiry, the second Leveson inquiry. Is this just a free pass for mainstream media organisations at the expense of organisations like the Sikh Press Association? And we also would like to ask, what will your parties do to tackle a regulation of corporate media malpractice?
Thank you for that, Tristan. Chris, please.
I'll try and be brief because we're going to try and be a bit briefer.
Yeah.
I think there's a number of things we need to do. We need to tackle the ownership of these big media conglomerates. So that needs to be sorted in terms of, we've got tax exiles basically owning large chunks of our media. We should be implementing Leveson in full. We should be giving people a right of reply when they get things wrong, of equal size to the original article. The problem is often when they do put excuse me, I dropped something. When they do put forward, an apology, it's very often buried away in side pages, so people don't really see it. So that needs to be sorted out, and I think if we could do that. But one, I think that would raise standards. But secondly, it would give that assurance that people can get their sort of right of reply properly heard and aired, and get the facts actually straight.
So you think of reciprocation of prominence with regard to retractions of stories and apologies?
But we also need to tackle ownership of the media as well.
Yeah, but in the event that a misrepresented story or fact is financially damaging to those who were misrepresented, is an apology enough?
No, it isn't, and I think compensation should be forthcoming, absolutely.
And that would be legislated for?
Well, I would certainly be pressing for that. Most certainly, I think that where people have suffered injury in that way, then it's only right and proper. And, the problem is, that type of remedy is only available to people if they're wealthy. And it should be something which is available to all of us.
And if I could just add one point to that that I'd like the panellists to speak on. What role do you think the Independent Press Standards Organisation can have in regulation of the media? Because a lot of smaller organisations, like the one that I work for, feel that they're either toothless or actually outright apathetic when it comes to problem issues that we kind of bring forward to them. I mean, this story that I gave an example of is massively tarnishing on the Sikh community, talking about terror camps in the UK. No such evidence of anything exists. And yet the article is still online today, and somehow the Daily Mail are being told that they're allowed to get away with this. They were cleared of any wrongdoing by the Independent Press Standards Organisation. So I'd like you to also speak on what role you think they will have in regulation.
Have a role, because they are, a vested interest. They are effectively representing the powerful media barons. I mean, it's ridiculous. Self-regulation has been proven over and over and over again. How many more times? Do we have to sort of prove this fact that it does not work? You need independent regulation. And I know they rail against that and say, the freedom of the press. But, the broadcast media seems to manage quite well.
I think it's really not on for you simply to blame this on the media barons. We're living in a world where fake news is being produced by governments. Donald Trump is tweeting every day. All kinds of fake news. They're supposed to be the head of the most powerful democracy in the world. We've got people being slandered. I work in the media, and it's kind of open house. And a lot of these big media companies, I'm not going to the ones, what's the responsibility they have as well? You know, if they're providing a platform for all kinds of fake news to be put out there, surely they have responsibility. So it's not just the bad ones.
Samantha, would you like to say something?
I would. I'd love to.
Just add one more point just to that, just to on top of
Absolutely,
what Sorry, just
no
last point. Through our investigations, we found the reason why the Daily Mail were cleared of any wrongdoing is because simply they reprinted a story that was in Indian media. So the Indian media, as most Sikhs will be aware, often kind of portray the Sikh community or elements of the Sikh community in a way which fits a state narrative, and that's why the Daily Mail were allowed to get away with it according to the Independent Press Standards Organisation. So I mean, how do you even police that? Because that is exactly what Gurnal was saying, that fake news doesn't only come from kind of the media, sometimes it comes from organisations like the Indian government.
Yeah, well, that's a challenge, isn't it?
Well, with regard to Ofcom regulations, what we're governed by, the BBC isn't. It has its BBC charter, so therefore it has different rules that it plays by. But with regard to print media and the laws of libel, and defamation is if you repeat something that is false, whether you knowingly repeat it or otherwise. So for the Daily Mail in particular to plagiarise or borrow from a known biased media source, should they not have some sort of sanction in the UK, even if their source is Indian?
Well, I think they should, certainly, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, yes, there are other challenges and other problems of fake news and all the platforms that are used for that purpose. But don't let the media barons off the hook, because they are culpable. Let's deal with that. We can deal with that. The other thing is more of a challenge, and we need to look at that. Let's not ignore it, and let's not sort of gloss over it in that sense. But because because that is a challenge and maybe more tricky to deal with, don't let the media barons off the hook, for goodness sake. They've been let off the hook for far too long.
So, I mean, I agree with the things that Chris has said about implementing Leveson and looking at the actual independence of the regulation that's happening there. So I won't repeat any of that. So, but actually, the point I was going to make builds on what you've just said. There is a political agenda behind what the press are doing here, and I think that's something that shouldn't be overlooked. There is a tremendous link between money and power in government, and you only have to look at the number of MPs who have links to private companies with contracts to do with the NHS, for example, or who are being lobbied by big hitters in the energy industry. And it's the same with the media. There is a very cushy relationship between the right-wing governments and the right-wing political parties and the right-wing media. And whether that's donations to political parties, whether that's deals for them to sit. I mean, don't we have a certain ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer who's now editor of the Evening Standard? And that
I don't think he's doing her any favours, though.
No, I don't think he does anybody any favours unless he was to go away somewhere far away. But there is a relationship there between those political parties and these newspapers. So there is a political agenda and a political bias. And the only way really that you can deal with that is by legislating around the funding of political parties to break that link between money and power. It should never be the case that justice and representation and democracy is available only to those people who can afford it. And that's the case we have at the moment. We do not live in a democracy. We absolutely do not. We live in with the nearest financially based equivalent that you could come up with. It is a sham of a democracy where people buy power. Until we start dealing with that, and it does mean coming back to challenging, the monopoly held by the media barons over there, but it also means looking at that political bias. It does mean challenging that corruption there. And until we deal with that, we're going to continue to see, people scapegoated. We're going to continue to see fake news treated as though it has any credibility.
With regard to the NHS, I think Sukhvinder Kaur has a relevant question to ask of the panel.
I'll just quickly touch on this, just very briefly.
If you wouldn't, yeah, absolutely.
I think it's answers like saying that democracy does not exist in the UK is what's adding to the problem of making voters apathetic. So although democracies may not be perfect here, it most certainly does exist in the UK, and it is a system that we have, so we need to engage and encourage people to get involved. I think if you print a lie, or if you publish a lie, you say a lie and you broadcast a lie, you should pay a fine. There should be, again, back to penalties, because if they're retrospectively even held accountable, then they will make sure that they check what's coming out of India to a T. The problem here, at the heart of it, is journalism is dead. We have today journalism where it's repeated stories one after the other, after the other, after the other. So when somebody creates a lie and gives you a whole page to tell you why that lie, fake news, they put it forward, that will get shared by some other media, and then everybody will share it. And it's going to happen, I guarantee you, before the June 8th election is over. There'll be lots of fake news, and then, you know what, 2 weeks later, they'll tell you the truth, but it'll be too late. We get played as a government. So one solution would be crowdfunding, a solution for our own. There's a crowdfunding site right now that is a crowdfunding to fact-check live debates like this, obviously national debates between the leaders. So they'd be sitting there fact-checking it themselves. So we don't have to depend on the media barons. We don't have to depend on the government agencies, which are apathetic. We, the people, can take matters into our own hands and get our educated people that are already had the solutions in hand, fund them through our own money, and actually hold people out to account. So when the Daily Mail does publish these things, the problem is that the world doesn't know about it because all the other newspapers don't have a vested interest in publicizing the negative and the wrong and the fallacious thing Daily Mail is doing because they're doing it themselves.
What
so we need to make sure everybody knows.
Was they pretty much tarnished the reputation of the Sikh community in the UK.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for the reason being that they wanted to tarnish the image of the Sikh in the UK, but it was a continuation of a policy in India. And that policy in India is, for want of a better phrase, it's an evolution of the caste system and the interreligious conflict that exists in India for centuries. That is slowly being imported into the UK, and it's being almost sort of by stealth, it's being encouraged by a media that is soft selling it to those who understand it. And I think Jaspreet Panda, I apologise. Jaspreet has a question that's quite relevant to that, because at the moment we sit where a Conservative government had agreed to caste discrimination legislation and then was put under immense pressure by a community that would have been adversely affected by being able to discriminate one way or another. And because of that, they've now begun a second round of consultation which ends in, I believe, the next 6 or 8 weeks.
It's actually the first proper public consultation.
Yeah.
And it's not just these extremist religious groups, it's also the Indian government. When Narendra Modi was over, he threatened in regards to economic deals. So my question is, what will your party do to ensure that legislation and legal protection is available against caste? There is a article which means it needs to be ratified. We're now at the point where the government's possibly discussing repealing it, which is terrifying considering that we are a massive diaspora in terms of the Indian community, but it's a South Asian problem, it's not just India.
No. Jess? Jagmeet?
So I believe that we, again, need to legislate and protect. We need to point out the problems. And caste is, unfortunately, it's relevant in all the communities. People, as a Sikhi was actually brought about to destroy the caste system. So as a Sikh, we cannot. But there's also something called the Punjabi culture. And we have the government agencies, like India, that are actually promoting casteism from within. So I know in India especially, they try to tell the Jats that they're the best, that they're the most hardcore warriors, and they promote negative aspects of the Jat culture, or the Punjabi culture, alcoholism, boisterousness, things that are not actually within the religion. They sell them back to the public through Bollywood, through Hollywood, through the media again, as positives, so the generations, the younger generations come up, get brainwashed into thinking that the wrong things are actually the right things. So again, one thing that they're missing is that the youth, especially here in the West, are not thick. The people living here in England and in the West are switched on. So we can see the games that they're playing, and you know what we do? We get activated, like myself, and we get involved, because we can see that there's a real threat, And the only way to change it is by people that actually understand the problem, that have actually lived through the problem themselves, that have faced it on a daily basis. Because I'm sure my colleagues here may have never dealt with caste discrimination in their life.
Just feel free to.
And unfortunately,
I just want to raise two things there.
Yeah.
First of all, the problem here is that caste is seen to be intricate with religion. Now, it's come from a religion, but actually it's devolved into something completely separate. It's a social structure. And so our main problem when trying to get legislation in place is that religious groups are saying it's our religious belief. It's not necessarily. It's become something entirely on its own. It's a social structure. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. The fact that you mentioned like Sikhi doesn't include it, I completely agree. I'm a Sikh and I don't practice caste, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in our community. And I just want to know what you'd want to do to.
It's become a tool. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's become intricate within the social identity of being Punjabi or being Hindu, being Sikh, being even Buddhist and Christian.
Yeah. Well, I think it's about.
So we need
and then a subdivision beyond that.
Yeah, and also secondly, that legislation that's coming in place is only in the public sphere. It's not about marriage or anything like that. It's just about discrimination in the workplace, things like that. So that's really key. I think people are confusing that. They're thinking it's a social identity issue.
I just want to bring in a wider subcontinent perspective, because one of the arguments that's been presented by the Indian government is that caste doesn't exist in Hinduism, that somehow it was the British that brought the caste system into India to classify the different people. It was a divide and rule strategy. But just this week, we've just got this report about Yogi Adityanath, who's the chief minister of UP, which is the largest state in, and this heading, these Dalits wanted to go and meet him, and he asked them to actually give him soap and shampoo that they should wash before they came to see him. And he has been praised by the Indian government. So there's a kind of
on Wednesday afternoon, he asked the Sikh to remove his turban.
But the tragedy is, and there's people from the Sikh Council here as well.
The turban on your head.
The tragedy is that there are people from the Sikh Council here as well who've also been arguing against anti-caste legislation, almost kind of buying the Indian government narrative. So I mean, Chris, if you get into power, I mean, you're against discrimination. Surely the Dalits in this country deserve to be protected, and across the world as well.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, discrimination is discrimination, and it's not an area I'm aware of it, not to the same extent as the community is, obviously, but this is where I think policy makers need to be liaising with the community, and this is where the kind of bottom-up approach, which is something Jeremy Corbyn strongly advocates, that we should be responding to the community at large, the public at large in that sense, and not having a sort of a top-down agenda in that sense. But I don't buy that argument. It's our culture, it's a religion, and all the rest of it. I mean, and the more extreme version is kind of female genital mutilation, which was often sort of excused on the grounds, well, this is cultural, and it's what we do, and it's just unacceptable. Abuse is abuse. Discrimination is discrimination, and I think policymakers have got to be sophisticated enough to be able to, and brave enough to actually take that head on.
Chris, the legislation exists. It's not been ratified. So post legislation becoming law, it now has gone back to a consultation process, and that's under pressure.
Indeed,
well, that's the perception. The perception of it is it's under pressure from a particular community.
Well, I mean,
who are demanding that it be repealed.
We've not mentioned the Conservative Party tonight, but I suspect the sort of kind of a post-Brexit agenda led by a Conservative government. They would be, I think, less willing to. The
question is, will Labour oppose any kind of repeal of that legislation?
Well, certainly speaking personally, I have to be honest, and I don't know what our sort of official position is on that. But
I can help you though.
Okay, cool,
Jeremy Corbyn was actually the Labour representative within the all-party parliamentary group, so he's extremely aware of the issue with this, and he's an advocate for us. Can't mention it in the agenda there because there's strong religious groups that are fighting against this, but we know that personally he does have that agenda.
Indeed. Well, listen, I mean, coming from us to the perspective that he does, and I think very similar to the perspective to my own. I think we'd be looking and pushing at an open door in regards to that. My concern, though, and the point I was going to make about the post-Brexit negotiations and trying to build these sort of trade deals, as it were, with India, they may, if there's pressure coming from the Indian government, that might make a kind of a Conservative administration, more willing to accede to those pressure coming from external sources in India, not to therefore go forward with the sort of legislation that you are, or implement or ratifying.
Ratifying it.
You are referring to.
So we've got to be brave on that, it seems to me, and that's where I think a Labour government negotiating a post-Brexit scenario would be one that would work in the interest of make the economy work for ordinary people again and find ways of getting the best of both worlds. One, sort of protecting the rights of people whilst ensuring that we've got an economy that works for everybody, not just those at the top.
Dr. Bogle, what is the Sikh Council stand on this subject?
I think there is a consultation going on the 14th of June,
right,
and it's going to be held at Birmingham University. There's a meeting going on, and we're going to be taking part in it and see what's going on there, really. Because
in principle, do you support the legislation that exists should be ratified?
It should be ratified, but the legislation, of course, is not going to stop any of the discrimination on caste. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen anyway.
Murder is going to happen. If you can't stop somebody murdering somebody, it's still illegal.
You can't. It's illegal. But what I'm saying is, yeah, we are asking for changes on it, really. So we'll see how it goes.
What changes are you looking for in particular?
So we had a meeting with the Sikh Council UK, and the problem was that the NISA report, which is a government report, solely used Sikh examples, which is incorrect. That's not the right way to address that. But unfortunately, we had no feed into that, and neither did the main groups.
That's obviously an issue.
That's created another issue when dealing with the legislation, because it makes Sikhs seem as if they are the ones perpetuating caste.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's a government, and that's made the council against the legislation, unfortunately. But there's nothing that we, as people who are trying to advocate equal rights despite caste,
do you think that was by accident?
Can do about that.
Do you think that was a mistake?
I think that's a massive mistake, yes.
You don't think it was purposely done?
No, well, I don't know if it was purposely done.
To divide possible allies?
I'm not sure, because I've got nothing to do with NISA. But if those had been anonymised, if there had not been a particular religion, that would have addressed the issue perfectly fine. And that's come out of this discussion now.
Dr. Bogle, is that the issue? Is that the reason you're procrastinating?
I'm not quite up to the point on these anyway, because obviously last time we had the meeting, we actually did decide that it does not exist in Sikhs, but there were some examples which came through, but it should not be a Sikh issue anyway.
Dr. Bogle, in principle, does the Sikh Council agree that any form of caste discrimination, regardless of religious orientation, is wrong and should be legislated against to make illegal?
Well, the thing is that legislation, if they're looking for it, then
regardless of religion, in principle, any discrimination based on caste should be outlawed.
Well, that's what they've been tackling racial discrimination on it. They've been tackling sexual harassment on it.
Absolutely.
So if they're looking for anything like that, yes, why not?
Thank you. If we can, I'd like your first question, if you would.
Oh, okay. Well, this is what will the candidates do to increase the Sikh representation in Parliament and in public appointments, and the current system controls through person specification and needs close scrutiny?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I'm really glad that was your question, because that was sort of my answer to Jaspreet's question just now. It's talking about when you're looking at an issue like this, you have to look at who are the decision makers, who's making the legislation, who's making the decision about is this going to ratification, is this going back to consultation phase. And when those decisions are being made by people who are not affected by this issue, you can't really. I wouldn't say you can't expect. You should be able to expect, but you need to have people who are part of those communities in the legislative process, not just being consulted on or tokenistic gestures saying, "Oh yeah, come along and tell us about your experience and write us an article that we'll broadly ignore." So increasing representation across the board in Parliament is incredibly important. And I think I'm going to come back to my tin drum about electoral reform again, and there is a very good reason for that. With the first past the post electoral system we have at the moment, it breeds laziness really amongst political parties, where you have so many safe seats where parties don't have to work particularly hard to put forward a candidate who can appeal to voters. When you have a proportional representation system and you have larger constituencies that will have more than one representative, but like we have had in the European elections, the pressure is on the parties much more to put forward a whole slate of candidates for their party that are representative and that appeal to people. It forces us to work harder to find candidates from the communities to have that diversity represented. represented. And that's really a huge way to get more people into Parliament, part of that legislative process, you know, at all levels of government, not just Westminster, but local government as well, and getting people feeling like their opinion matters and their vote matters, and that they're, you know, comes back to saying politics is something that we all do, we all participate in. It shouldn't be something that a bunch of old white men sitting in House of Commons do.
The Green Party are very good at these kind of platitudes around representation, because basically your philosophy is anarchy, isn't it? I mean,
not entirely.
In the last census, the Jedi Knights religion had about 300,000 votes. Or you know, so would you
not discriminating, are you?
So would you say that the Jedi Knights should also have proportion? And where do you go? You create fragment, and the politics of identity surely is not the right way to create cohesion. And Jagmeet Singh, I know that you're going to respond to this by saying you're acting out this, but surely by standing in a constituency where there's a good chance of a Sikh actually being elected and splitting the Sikh vote, you're actually working against the very aspiration that Dr. Pogel is projecting.
That point. Go ahead. Oh, wait. Go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, do Jedi Knights deserve to have special recognition? I don't know. I'm not aware of Jedi being recognised as an official religion, but I'm sure that's a conversation we're going to have later. I think identity...
I'm a secret Jedi Knight.
Oh, well, you go. There you go. Using the Jedi mind trick on me then. No, I wouldn't say that the Green Party advocates anarchy at all. I mean, we have some really bold ideas about how we, democratic reform, economic reform. We're not ashamed to say that our ideas are bold, because big change is what we need. But coming back to the issue of identity and representation in Parliament, it's not about tokenistically picking people out and saying, you're this religion over here, you can do this. You're this one over here, you're that colour over there, you're this gender. It's not about sort of quotas and gestures in that sense, but it is about politics is dominated by old white men. It is. I mean, I live in Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire. My local paper printed an article which listed all of the candidates for all of the parties across all of the constituencies in Staffordshire and Cheshire. There are 40 candidates in total, 34 of them are white men. There are 6 women, not a single person of colour amongst anywhere, and that's two counties, and that's what's being offered at the moment politically, and that's not okay. And we have to look at what is wrong with the system that is disenfranchising people from marginalised communities from coming forward, but also reinforcing the social structures that mean that the same people get to dominate the legislative process, the political process, and ultimately mean that when you come back to situations where you have a really important piece of legislation that is affecting people's daily lives and their well-being, it gets battered around because the people who are making the decisions don't care about it. Change who the decision makers are. Change the system.
Yeah, Jagmeet Singh.
Dr. Gurnam Singh, I'm actually quite embarrassed and disappointed in your question, but I know that you sometimes say controversial things just to add to the debate, so I thank you for it anyway. It's not about me being a Sikh. If there's another Sikh running in my constituency, which there is another Sikh, a Punjabi man from a Sikh family running in our constituency of Wolverhampton South West, does that mean I, as a Sikh, cannot run? I take you to Ontario, Canada, where Jagmeet Singh, the MP for the National Democratic Party, he is now running to be the leader of the NDP.
MPP. He's not an MP.
No, NDP, the National Democratic Party.
No, he's a member of the provincial parliament. He's not a member of parliament.
Okay, regardless, Jagmeet Singh, he's running to be the leader of his party and possibly the next prime minister of one of the biggest nations in the world. And that didn't happen because one Sikh happened to run that, because a whole bunch of Sikhs were running against each other and the best Sikh won. So I don't want anybody to vote for me because I've got a turban and a beard and I happen to be a Sikh. That's maybe the worst reason to vote for somebody. Don't vote for me for that. Please hear what I have to say. Our manifesto can be found on our website. It should be uploaded by tomorrow. The website is www.jagmeetsinghpanth.com. Go onto our Facebook page. Look at what the policies are. Because you know what? That Sikh that you mentioned, he is a Tory, and he was actually in power from December 2010 into December 2015. Find out what his voting records were. He voted against disability living allowances. He voted against the very people he's supposed to serve. He, to me, has very un-Sikh-like values. So what I hope to bring to Parliament, what I hope to bring to this debate, and what I hope to bring to our country is the values of compassion, of working hard, of sharing and caring and taking care of your neighbor. And I really don't care if I win, but I do care if our country moves in the right direction. And I implore every one of you, if you're not going to vote for me, vote for the Labour candidate in my constituency, who's Eleanor Smith, because you know what? She's a black woman. More than that, she's a really decent human being. I have nothing against Eleanor Smith, but you know what? I have a lot against the Labour Party locally in Wolverhampton because they have massively let the constituency down. The Tories and Labour are tearing
The incumbent's the Labour, yeah?
Sorry?
Isn't the incumbent for Wolverhampton South West?
Well, certainly. So I would say that the problems that Wolverhampton of unemployment, of businesses closing down, of the horrible homeless issue that we're facing, and they call them rough sleepers, because maybe it sounds a bit better than saying the guy doesn't. These people have no homes. That's not only the Labour's fault, who have been in power for the last 2 years, it's also the Tories. So for the last 7 years, the government has let us down. So we need to scrap them. And we need fresh blood in there that's going to bring forward an ideology that champions British values. So I'm not saying me, the Sikh, I'm saying what can my Sikh values do for you, the British people, and let's make a national change. And that would go back to Mr. Bogle's question. I'm actually doing everything I possibly can do to address your point of no Sikhs in Parliament. But to be fair, I think I've done most of everything I could, and that was create a party, get local and national support, fundraise over £6,000.
I think the point Mr. Bogle was making was why should any community feel the need that they have to make their own party? Why are they not inclusive in the societies in which they live? You shouldn't have to make your own social club. You shouldn't have to make your own housing estates. You shouldn't have to make your own anything. That's the point.
I'll answer that point. The people of Wolverhampton South West are in the very unique position to drive real change for the next generations, for the future elections. Because you know what? I guarantee you're going to see a lot more diversity within Labour and in Conservatives, and a lot more different values within Wolverhampton South West in the next election. It's already a guarantee, just by myself stepping forward. So we shouldn't need to, unfortunately, we should not need to go create our own parties. But the fact is, within the system that we have been given, I didn't create the system. I've just researched it, learned about it, and I'm using the system. Instead of being apathetic, sitting at home and saying, let these people deal with it, I said, no more. I can't trust them to do it. I have a responsibility to my constituents, to my family, to my neighbours, to every marginalised community, and to the British public. And as such, I want to encourage everybody, make your own political party and get reinvigorated and force the people at the table into a corner and force them for the next 5 years, next 10 years to change their ways. And I guarantee you, if you get involved now, it'll be a better day for our children.
Okay, Dr. Manjeet Kaur, I fear he's answered your question. So I'll ask you to ask your question to the panel anyway. And if Chris, you could answer first, please.
Yes, my question is a bit different from the committee, but this problem is national problem. I'm from Coventry Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre. This is from Cressack. Since 2009, we have seen a threefold increase in demand for our services. In addition, since 2011 and 12, we have seen a 134% national rise in reported, I will say 134% national rise in reported rapes to the police, and yet the conviction rate for rape remains static at around 7%. You might know all. Given this context, how would you and your party seek to address sexual violence and abuse?
I mean, it's an important area, and I think one of the things now is that people feel more confident about reporting this abuse. And that's not to say that there's been a huge rise. I think you probably agree with me on that. These things have often been swept under the carpet in previous times. So, in a sense, it's progress that we're seeing, that people are feeling confident now that they are coming forward. There is an issue, obviously, though, about successful prosecutions, but we also have to be careful that people, justice is done, and that people don't end up with false convictions. But I think again, resourcing is an issue, and being sensitive to this issue in terms of policy making is, it's a very difficult and tricky area, I think. And I think we're sort of, you know, in a way, a start of a, well, maybe not the start of a journey, but sort of somewhere along the journey. We haven't quite got anywhere near the destination yet in that sense. And I think it comes back to behaviours as well, and addressing the behaviours and the culture that actually leads to the abuse taking place in the first instance. Legislation is important, but ultimately, you know, you want to change behaviours, and that's, you know, culturally something.
Chris, is it anywhere similar to the situation around racial and religious violence, where we're seeing this non-stigmatisation of a social trend, and that it's actually encouraged by the media to sexualise women and girls?
Well, I mean, that's been an issue for a long time, the sexualisation of women and girls. I mean,
but is this the result of that sexualisation?
To some extent, maybe. I'm not sure that's maybe just a bit slightly too simplistic.
Absolutely,
to
of course.
That is the reason. And
no, a factor, not the reason.
A factor,
I wouldn't suggest that.
But I think we can beat ourselves up, because I mean, I think, you know, we have made huge progress actually. Socially,
not in terms of attitudes. It's static at 7%.
No, in terms of convictions, but just in terms of attitudes. Attitudes to race, attitudes to women. I mean, things have, compared to the sort of 60s and 70s, the situation...
gone up 134%.
But I think attitudes, though, are shifting and changing, and we've got to go further down that road, it seems to me. And I think there's also an issue, just coming back to Jagmeet's points earlier on, about, I mean, in terms of, you know, decency and compassion and so on. I mean, I'd like to come and join the Labour Party, because that's very much our kind of programme now in that sense. So
we did try. We put a lot of good people through to Labour, but they're playing dirty politics, and they just put somebody forward that actually looks good on paper, that has no intention of really winning, which is unfortunate. So let the Labour Party sort themselves out.
Is sexual violence and rape something that is important to yourself?
I mean, as a woman, as a survivor of sexual assault, it's something that I feel personally is far from somewhere that we've come on leaps and bounds with, actually. That there's a huge societal problem. I mean, we live in what many people justifiably call a rape culture, and you only have to look at the proliferation of rape jokes. You know, you have university campuses where they almost turn it into a game, this idea of what is and isn't consent. And again, that is replicated in the media.
We have phenomena coming now of stealthing and things
exactly,
of that nature.
Yeah, and it's absolutely horrendous, and I feel in many ways
do you feel it's trivialised?
Totally trivialised. And I think one of our manifesto pledges is about implementing a UK-wide strategy to tackle gender-based violence. So that's domestic violence, sexual abuse, FGM, trafficking. You know, we need a UK-wide strategy to actually look at that, to increase conviction rates. And again, you look at it, it comes back again to who are the decision makers in this, and then who's actually implementing this. When you have judges in courtrooms who are making horrendous comments, victim blaming, talking about what was the victim wearing, how were they behaving, were they drunk, and then again,
what the sexual history is now.
Yeah, it comes up all the time, and it is used, and victim blaming is a huge problem that contributes not only towards a low conviction rate, but towards perpetuating these societal ideas that somehow a woman who is raped is culpable for something that's happened to her. The only people who are ever to blame for rapes are rapists, 100%, nobody else at all. But we see this again reflected. I'm going to come back to blaming the media again. Just look at what happened. The media, it took a few hours on Tuesday, there's the horrible news broke about what happened in Manchester. Just a few hours for the Daily Mail to print an article saying that Ariana Grande's concert had been targeted by this person because of the outfits that she wore on stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they blamed her right there. They overtly sexualised a young performer, and they blamed her sexualisation for the attacks, which killed 22 people. I mean, that's disgusting, and it is indicative of this culture that we have, which denigrates
false allegations. I heard this it was false allegations. 7% conviction rate. We said. So, what about these false allegations?
I kind of want to add on to that actually. Yeah. We always use that fear of we're gonna maybe accidentally convict somebody who may not have convicted rape, and the false allegations percentages are so low compared to the amount of victims and survivors there are out there, and the fact that we don't want to push down on conviction rates and prosecution rates because we're worried about false allegations then gives out that message to victims and survivors that sorry, your attack and what happened to you isn't as important, and what you're going to have to deal with for the rest of your life isn't as valuable, and your life isn't as valuable as the person who may potentially be falsely accused. And I think we keep hiding behind this massive myth that there's so many false allegations, and we're further pushing victims and survivors into silence because we're not doing anything about it. We know rape and sexual abuse is a horrific crime, but we still seem to not let victims and survivors know that because we're not punishing the people who are doing it. We're just kind of really letting some of them walk free.
To add on to that, because I've dealt with actual cases where just trying to get the victims, especially the Asian community, there's such a massive taboo in just getting a victim to speak about what happened to them. So we get them to a point where we get a statement made, and because a victim hasn't got video footage or evidence that she was, then you have this grey area of grooming, don't you, where something could have happened, something was about to happen, but an intervention's taken place, but nothing can happen to someone who's been grooming. There's this big grey area in grooming, something that no one wants to talk about, but it exists, within all of our communities. We've taken it to the police refer it back as a community issue, and that community doesn't want to do about it because, like you said, the representation is old men. So there's so many layers to this. How would you help us as a community? Because we're finding that our community isn't helping. So then we have to then come to the law, we have to come to our MPs, we have to come outside of the community now to help those victims get justice. How would you help support us?
I'd like to address that just very quickly, because I know a lot of points have been made. This whole conversation from the beginning, it reminds me of what happened in Rotherham. Rotherham, where the grooming of young children, our babies, went on for decades, and everybody denied it. And you know what? There's horrible people in this world, and there's horrible people that are going to continue to victimize and hurt our innocent children and females and our family members. But you know what? Who I do blame, and I'll say it directly, I blame your MPs. Because Labour was in charge during that time, and you know what? They were completely silent on the issue. How can your...
They were councillors.
Well, I'm just saying, I'll explain to you. How can your elected officials that don't even believe in their own system help you? Because if you have people that are saying, here today even, that why would you bother making tougher laws when nobody's going to enforce those laws? We need a holistic approach where we are having such stringent, strict laws and punishments. We need punishments that you wouldn't even think twice in your mind of hurting a child or a woman. You would not... No, one second. If you must have that first. Then you must have the system that actually supports that. So you must invest in our police. We must treat these kind of crimes, especially grooming and child abuse, with the same reverence that we do with terrorism. Now, we don't sit there with terrorism and say, oh, you know what, I'm going to wait for the bomb to go off. Well, maybe we do, because look what's happening in Manchester, unfortunately. With all of our civil liberties and rights being eroded by the day, are we ever better off for it?
More resources.
So I hope we are, but...
Yeah, I would like to ask you a question now. Please. You said, we need resources. How would you... We recognize now rape crisis centers. We are charitable organizations, and we are always rely on funding, and we have to struggle for funding. Would your party be responsible for that, or be put in your agenda? How
well, Labour's very clear in terms of funding for public services, and third sector organisations would clearly flow from that, so that would not be an issue. But we've got to go further back again, because once you get to the point where somebody's been abused, we've got to go further back, to try and look at why are these things happening in the first place. And there's no quick fix, easy answer. It is a very kind of difficult area, and honestly, stiffer penalties will not work. I mean, look, in some countries, it's a part of the solution. Well, hold on, in some countries, it's that you face the death penalty for trafficking drugs. People still traffic drugs.
Literally just written that down in my notes.
So you kind of, that will not work. You've got to do more. You've got to work with communities.
But we definitely need more police. We need to treat it.
I agree with you. We need more police. We need more resources. We need more funding for third sector organisations. And you've got to address those social situations.
Jagreer Singh has a question, which is interesting in light of what you've just said. You're talking about when something happens and the trauma of that, you have to understand, go back and start looking at things and how we've got to whatever point we've got to. With the Sikh community, and Jagreer Singh's question as well, about the continued tarnishing of the Sikh image in the public mind from Indian media, and now more so by the British media. It all has to go back to a certain point, and you have to see why that's happening before you can stop an entire community being traumatized. And we have multiple thousands of rape victims who, to this day, their rapists walk past their houses every day. Now, Tom Watson has said that if you were to get into power, he would be more than willing to have an independent inquiry into what Britain knew or possibly participated in with regard to the attack on the Golden Temple in 1984, the Shri Harmandir Sahib. Jagveer Singh has a question that expands on that, and I'd like your answer in particular, being from Tom Watson's party,
Indeed, of course.
and potentially being on the government side of the House on June the 9th.
Yeah. So I think you covered my first question. I think on political engagement, I think you've answered that quite well. So this question is essentially, it would be good to have a Conservative representative here, but unfortunately they haven't turned up.
Of all people, Paula Poole was one of the 6 people we approached, and the chair remains empty.
With David Cameron having declared government documents relating to Sikhs and the Punjab exempt from becoming public under the terms of the 30-year rule, how do you propose to remedy the singling out of the UK Sikh community from having access to their own historical record pertaining to a traumatic and painful 15 years from the years of 1982 to 1997? Don't Sikhs, who have contributed so much to the UK economy, public life and society, deserve to know what their government knows about the events that have scarred their relatives and friends?
Well, my view is yes, they do, and it's something that locally I've been working with the Sikh community and been pushing for and calling for a few years now, actually. And I'm pleased to say that in the Labour manifesto, I was just flicking to it when you were asking the question, on page 119, Labour remains committed to an independent inquiry into Britain's military role in the 1984 raid on the Golden Temple in Amritsar. So I think that, and it's not just that, where the government has drawn a veil and been unwilling to release documents, a range of other controversial issues, nothing to do with the Sikh community, where they have applied a similar kind of ruling. And
a blanket ban on all documents being released
yes,
pertaining
absolutely.
to a particular community.
Well, yes, the Shrewsbury 24, for example, is relating to a building workers' dispute where people were, under the Industrial Relations Act in 1972, sent to prison, including one who was Ricky Tomlinson, the well-known actor. And they've cited national security and have refused to release the documents even more than 40 years after the events occurred. And there should be openness. And we're committed in relation to the raid on the Golden Temple to look at that and get those documents made available. But it's not just in that regard. I think across the piece there should be more openness in government, and particularly the 30-year rule. The 30-year rule should be the 30-year rule. It should apply.
Regardless of community, regardless of time, regardless of anything else.
Well, I think we should be more open, and I think there is this 30-year rule, and that was brought in for whatever reason, because sometimes releasing information may be problematic at the time. But I don't think if you have a rule, you shouldn't then because it's inconvenient overrule that particular rule. And as I say, in relation to this issue anyway, in terms of the British government involvement in that raid on the Golden Temple, very clear commitment from the Labour manifesto in terms of that.
I'm sorry, but that's just not good enough, and I tell you why. The Labour manifesto does not go far enough. I could raise an inquiry tonight myself. It's not going to amount to a tin of beans. Labour's been around for many decades. What have they done in regards to this issue for the last 3 years? Every single Labour candidate you're going to ever meet, we're going to say, well, privately I am doing it, I am raising the inquiry. This is not a Sikh issue.
But it wasn't privately I did it.
No, excuse me, I'm saying,
publicly.
When I say public, what I want you to have done is band together as a Labour Party.
Well, we've done that.
Excuse me, not today. Well, I'll tell you why that doesn't go far enough.
Isn't it?
Because everybody lauded it, everybody applauded it when that manifesto was released last week. Why did it take you till last week to figure out that the Sikhs have been lied to and the British public have been lied to, and the crimes against humanity have been hidden from the everyday British public for the last 3 years? So the Labour government has not done enough.
I agree with you.
I appreciate that they're paying lip service to the Sikhs and putting it in there now. I pray.
I think that's unfair.
Excuse me.
Lip service.
I'm telling you I believe it is.
We have a new leader of the Labour Party who was elected in 2015, and I think it's unfair to say.
I just want to.
Jeremy Corbyn has never paid lip service.
I just want to finish up. So if you just give me one. what the British, this is not a Sikh issue about 1984. This is a human rights British issue that every single person of British origin living in this country, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, or skin color, should be demanding the truth from their government and not doing it a week before the elections come out in their manifesto.
I think, just for clarity, it's something that One Sikh Council, Sikhs for Labour, there's been many organisations that have been continuously liaising, not just with Labour. Labour have been the most responsive. Just because my Sikh Council hat here and my Sikhs for Labour hat here, we were part of a roundtable discussion on November the 2nd that brought up this issue, and Jeremy Corbyn himself did, you know, sort of promise that there was real commitment to get an inquiry into that, and it's been going on for quite a few years.
Well, unfortunately, then everybody's let down the British public because it's not enough. We need someone who's going to champion and roar like a lion in Parliament until the truth is released. Because you know what? The British public have a right to the truth, and all we're asking for is the truth. So if the fault lies with Labour and the Sikh Council UK, then we should assign fault where it all lies. I commend them for trying their best, but new leadership and something different is needed. If you want something to change, change something.
But we've got new leadership, and that's why we've got this commitment.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time.
Oh no.
We are
Really
into the final minute of the show. All that's left for me to say is literally thank you to the panel for taking your time out on a Sunday evening in the middle of a bank holiday also. And you know, and braving the questions, because the questions haven't been easy, not by any stretch of the imagination. And also, I can only thank you all from the bottom of my heart for doing the same and coming out in the middle of a bank holiday, and even asking questions that are not necessarily easy to ask either. Considering there's an audience at home that will be judging how you asked and why you didn't include X, Y, Z into your questions. It takes a lot of guts and bravery for that. And also, Akaal Channel for allowing us to host it here also. So that was the Hunger Games, the Encounters live election debate. Unfortunately, the Conservatives didn't make it. They were given a 2-hour window, a chair, a bottle of water, a glass.
They don't care about the voters.
Yeah, I think that's a policy from top down, maybe not, but that's for them to decide when it comes June the 9th, and they may be one of the homeless that they've created for themselves. Whatever it is, and however it works out, we thank you all. We thank you at home for watching. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.